Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nigel Roberts, VP of Global Associations for LexisNexis and VP of the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome you all to our program and take the opportunity to sincerely thank NBA President C.K. Hoffler and her leadership for the opportunity to include this workplace inclusion panel at the NBA's first annual international summit. We are extremely honored. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our speakers for today's session, who will share data on the state of diversity and inclusion in the legal profession, discuss the better practices of inclusive workplaces, and provide a candid discussion of diverse talent of various ages, gender, and ethnicity, to uncover the challenges organizations must be willing to address to attract and retain diverse talent. Let me begin with my longtime colleague, Sandra Yamate, CEO of the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession, a 501c3 organization dedicated to creating a more diverse and inclusive legal profession through research and educational programming. The Institute's work addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US, as well as collaborations with partners in the UK, EU, and Latin America. Sandra spent 10 years as the director of the American Bar Association's Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity in the Profession, which is how we first met over 20 years ago, and partnered together with the ABA Judicial Division to launch the ABA Judicial Clerkship Program, which I'm delighted to say has grown over the years into a very successful program for minority law students, and which LexisNexis continues to support. Sandra is the immediate past chair of the National Judicial College and serves as a member of the board of the National Association of Women Lawyers. She also serves on the Leadership Advisory Council of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, chairs the Harvard Law School Asian American Alumni Group, and is a member of the New York City Bar Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Sandra earned her JD from Harvard Law School and has an ABA in Political Science, cum laude, and History, magna cum laude, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Jerry Roth is a litigation partner at Munger, Tolles & Olson in San Francisco and a former federal prosecutor in New York. Jerry specializes in cross-border civil and criminal litigation and international arbitration. He is the immediate past president of the Union International des Avocats, the world's oldest and most multicultural international lawyers association, representing millions of lawyers across the globe, and how Jerry and I first met. And Jerry has served as co-chair of the ABA Litigation Section's International Litigation Committee. Jerry holds a French language master's degree in European law from the Université de Paris, in addition to his JD from Harvard. Jerry has lectured recently on issues of diversity and inclusion at the international level, spearheaded a successful International Women Bar Leaders Day lecture series last year, and is currently working with the UIA to enhance networking opportunities for young African lawyers. In addition to his commitment to mentoring and coaching junior lawyers, Jerry partners with his firm and colleagues on a number of diversity and inclusion efforts, including diversity scholarships, a fellows program, a diversity summer program, and other pipeline programs, as well as affinity group initiatives for women, attorneys of color, LGBTQ lawyers, gender inclusion, and working parents. Pearl Mansu, whom I've had the pleasure to meet only with very recently and only virtually, is a student attorney in the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law. She is also a competitor on the school's mock trial team. Additionally, I'm delighted to say Pearl is a LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation Fellow, where she is leading a project to combat systemic racism in law firm practice. Pearl earned a Bachelor of Arts in Communications from the University of West Florida, where she concentrated on leadership communication and rhetorical analysis. There, she refined her skill set by competing on the speech and debate team and winning numerous titles in local and national competitions. Pearl went on to serve as Director of Communications and Arts for the largest predominantly African-American faith-based nonprofit in Northeast Ohio. As a Ghanaian-born millennial with a 5-year gap between undergrad and law school, Pearl is an advocate for the value that diverse and non-traditional talent add to legal practice. And last, but certainly not least, my fellow LexisNexis colleague, Ronda Moore, the first Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer for LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and who leads the development and implementation of a strategic inclusion and diversity agenda for our organization. Ronda was appointed to this role in July 2020 after leading LexisNexis through a historic period where she launched unconscious bias training and a courageous conversation series to help the organization better understand and openly discuss race and social justice. Prior to joining Lexis, Ronda worked with Accenture, Bank of America, Deloitte, and IBM. A native of Charlotte, North Carolina, Ronda completed her undergraduate studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and earned a graduate degree from North Carolina State University. My sincere thanks to each of the stellar panelists. I'd like to mention just one housekeeping item. This program is accredited for CLE, and during the program, you'll see a slide with the CLA code for you to attain that accreditation. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Ronda to lead today's discussion. Over to you, Ronda.
Thank you so much, Nigel, for the warm introductions and hearing all of the bios of our esteemed panel. I'm sure that I'm like everyone assembled here today. I'm feeling really excited and on the edge of my seat about what we've come together at this time and place to learn. So thank you to my panelists who I know are prepared to share some great insights. And thank you to all of you who have joined us. This has been indeed a historic time in, and there isn't a leader of any sizable organization who has not thought critically about how to address the issue of inclusion and diversity. And as organizations seek to increase the representation of diverse talent, they must be prepared to also assess and address inclusion in the workplace, because diversity without inclusion very rarely succeed. This panel will discuss best practices of inclusive workplaces, and we will have candid discussion of diverse talent of various ages, gender, ethnicity, to uncover the challenges organizations must be willing to address to attract and retain diverse talent. To start our panel, I'd like to ask Pearl to share with us a bit about the state of diversity within the legal profession. Pearl?
Absolutely, Rhonda. And I must say it is a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to be here on this panel with who I consider giants who are working tirelessly to make sure that we do have diverse representation in our industry, in the legal profession. But before I start, I believe we have the honor of having some words from President C.K. Hoffler, who's here before she proceeds to her other engagement. And so I'd like to yield the floor to her for a few moments.
Well, thank you so much, Pearl. To Nigel, I want to say thank you. For many of you who may not know this, LexisNexis is a global partner of the National Bar Association. We've been delighted with the partnership. It's been extraordinary. Nigel has been phenomenal. And we thank you, Nigel, for pulling this panel together and working with your team. Rhonda, we're very proud of you. Jerry, extraordinary. And Sandra, we're going to be honoring at a different point. So I want to say thank you to all of you. This issue, this topic is near and dear to my heart, as part of my practice does involve employment, more importantly, employment discrimination. So all of these workplace issues that you're discussing are so pertinent to today's environment, especially as we combat COVID. So again, I want to thank you for participating. Thank you for making our first virtual international conference special, spectacular, and important. And so many people are tuning in and are going to watch this over and over again. And I'm delighted that we're going to get CLE credit for this session. So I'm going to hand over the floor back to you, Pearl, and just know that we are proud of you as a student. And we're so delighted that you are one of the Rule of Law Fellows for LexisNexis.
Thank you, President.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and there's one more thing I forgot to say. How could I forget this? I wanted to recognize our Deputy General Counsel, Roderick Brown from the National Bar Association, who's also with LexisNexis. He's done an extraordinary job working with our General Counsel, David Green. So I just wanted to make sure that I gave him the appropriate recognition for the extraordinary job that he's done with us at the NBA, and I'm sure with you all at LexisNexis.
Sure, and I'm sure Pearl would agree with that, as Roderick is Pearl's mentor in our LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation Fellowship Program.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. I certainly agree. What a privilege it is to be mentored again by giants in the legal profession, you know, who are just so dedicated, not just by word, but also by deed, to our collective goal, which is to create a more diverse profession for all of us to enjoy. And with that, let me go ahead and get into some stats of what the current state of our profession is diversity-wise. And before I do, I have to say that again, I'm just full of honor to share not only stats that were derived by an organization created by my co-panelist, Sandra Yamate, but also one that my dear professor at the University of the District of Columbia, Professor Philip Lee, contributed largely to. And so it's so awesome to be able to share this. And with that said, we proceed into just highlights of the 2019 to 2020 IILP review. And this is the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession. There is a comprehensive report, but again, these are just highlights that we're presenting for today's purposes. And so to give a background on what the IILP does, the collective goal of the organization is to create again, a more diverse and inclusive legal profession in the US. And as part of this goal, the organization shares yearly stats and demographics on what it is or how diverse the profession is, specifically focusing on underrepresented groups in the legal profession within the United States. And so the categories that the IILP focuses on primarily are gender, race and ethnicity, disability, and LGBTQ community. And I do have to say there's more information or more stats for the gender group and the race and ethnicity group. And right now we're lacking when it comes to disability and LGBTQ. But as we grow more in this profession, of course, we're looking forward to seeing more stats when it comes to those groups as well. And so we begin with gender first off. And when it comes to gender, we start with female representation among lawyers in the United States. And we see that as of 2018, there's about 37% of female representation among lawyers in the US. And that's up from the 34%, which it was in 2008, just 10 years prior. And then it's up from 28% in 1998, which is 20 years prior. And here's a graphic that demonstrates the trail, if you'll say, how women trail behind representation as lawyers in the US. You see the comparison of 37%, again, compared to this vast 62% of men as lawyers in the United States. Now we go on to comparing women across professions. When you look at these numbers here, it may appear as though the legal profession is doing well when it comes to representing women. You see here civil engineers, where it's only 14%, almost 15% rather, of women representation, and in architects, almost 30% there. So a third of architects are women. So compared to these numbers, it may seem as though, our 37% is quite grand, but not so fast, because when we go across to other professions, with biological scientists being 47%, and even jumping down to accountants and auditors taking a notable majority of 60%. So almost 2/3 of accountants and auditors being women. And when you look at management and the professional workforce as a whole, a majority of 51% being women. This number is not so great anymore. Clearly, we're lagging behind when it comes to women representation of lawyers. Now we deal with women applicants to law school, and we'll touch this briefly. And so we're focusing here on the numbers from fall of 2010 through fall of 2015. You'll see that we began with 87,900, so almost 88,000 applicants to law school who were women in 2010. But then there was a significant 10% decrease in that, and an even greater decrease in just 2 years later, just fall of 2012. Now this tapered off in fall of 2015 by 2.2%, but then the numbers are still astounding, because again, there is a significant decrease from almost 90,000 applicants to just over 50,000 applicants who are women applying to law school in just this 5-year margin. And here's another, a graph that just briefly shows what that decrease looks like. Now, as far as women in law school, for the first time ever in 2016, we had a majority of women, or women who made the majority in law school. But this is attributed in part to the decline in admitted male students being greater than the decline in admitted female students during the same time. And it is noteworthy to say that the JDs awarded to women just a little bit over 20 years ago was at 30%, whereas it has increased by some 17% or 15% rather, just a few years ago in 2010 through 2011. Now, when it comes to actual practice, we'll see that with private practice, women make up 45%. And among judges, as of 2018, women made up a third of all judges in the United States. And as of 2015, with in-house counsel, just shy of 50%. So just shy of half of women who were in-house counsel lawyers, or lawyers rather, who were in-house counsel were women. Now, to move on to academia, and this is all as of 2013, law school deans made up just shy of a third, were composed just shy of a third being women. And as far as faculty goes, you'll see that tenured track faculty, there were 48% of them were women, but only 32% were had actually attained tenure at that point. And so we now segue to race and ethnicity. And we deal first with minorities in law school as of the 2013 to 2014 school year. And these numbers, all of these, to begin with, are all less than 10%. So for each category, for instance, with the Hispanic community, only 8%, almost 9% were Hispanic. And then there's a decrease when it comes to African Americans. Only 8% of those in law school within this school year were African American. It's even lower for Asian Americans. It's at almost 7%. A significant drop when it comes to those who identify as multiracial, just over 2%. And then not even 1%, clocking in at 0.8 Native American students when it comes to minorities in law school. Now, as far as minority judges, we have that just over 21% of all judges in 2018 were minorities, just over 21%. And again, this is another graph that just puts into context how low that number is compared to the majority of almost 80% white judges in our nation. Now, when we deal with the aggregate racial minority representation among the US, again, this is in 2018, we see that just over 15% here of lawyers are minority, compared to the almost 85% of majority white uh, lawyers across the US. And just to, again, put this into context and compare it to other professions, this number is quite low, ranging, when we compare from, 44% who are software developers, so just 5% shy of a majority there for minorities in software development. And then even for financial managers, you have 24% of those who are African Americans, or rather, who are minorities. And when I say minority, that includes, of course, the African American community, the Hispanic community, the Asian American community, the Native American community, and the multi-race community. So all those together, again, still only make up about 16% of the profession as a whole when it comes to who our lawyers actually are. Now, this table informs us that as far as the number, we could put a number of the amount of lawyers, the number of lawyers in our country, this includes both associates and partners, we're sitting at 1 million, almost 200,000, 1,200,000, so 1.2 million attorneys in our nation. We've seen that only about 37% of those were women. Um, and then 5.5% of those are African American. Just 6.1 are Hispanic. Just shy of 5% are Asian American. And this is quite astounding. Now we move on to the breakdown, and these are just associates. So we're taking away partnership here. We're taking away partners, and we're just focusing here on associates. When it comes to the total number of associates who are African American, we see that it's 4.5%. But for African American women, we're sitting at just shy of 3%. And with the Hispanic community, we're sitting at just shy of 5% here. And with women, that's roughly half of that at 2.5%. Now, it's a bit more promising for the Asian American community. We're looking at 11% who are Asian American as far as associates go. And it's split quite down the middle for women who are Asian Americans at 6.6%. And then we move on to now just partners. We'll start with Asian Americans, who make up 3.6% of partners across America. And if you're an Asian American woman, that number for you is 1.4%. For the Hispanic community, only 2.5% of partners across our entire nation are Hispanic. Less than 1%, sitting at 0.8%, are women of the Hispanic community. And now with African Americans, only 1.8%. So again, under 2% are African American. And if you're an African American woman rather, again, just less than 1% as far as the demographics when it comes to partnership in our nation. Now we move on to disability. And again, there is the data here with this category is lacking. So there's more work to do on gathering data on those with disabilities who are law graduates or who are lawyers. But most start off in private practice. 40% start off in private practice among this demographic. 20% start off in business, and we see that only 11% start off in public interest. And I have to note that this number changes quite often from year to year, just because of the small sample size that we have that we're working with of lawyers who have identified as having disabilities. And with the LGBT community, we see that as of 2018, only less than 4% of associates identified as being part of the LGBT community. And with partners, it was even lower, so just 2%. And we do have to also note that those who identify as LGBT are less likely to begin in private practice, so more likely to begin with public work than in private practice. And I just want to go back to this number here. So I am a law student who's graduating next year. And as someone who sees myself one day becoming a partner, this is the number I'm working with. This 0.7, less than 1%, when I ask myself, what does it look like for me as a Black millennial woman who wants to become a partner one day? These are my odds. It's not so promising. And with that, I turn the floor back over to you, Rhonda.
Pearl, thanks so much for taking us through the data. Really is insightful. And I'd like to hear from our other panelists. Let me invite Jerry to share what some of your initial reactions are hearing Pearl talk about the data and the current state of diversity in our profession.
Okay, sorry about that. Famous mute button. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. I am absolutely delighted and honored to be with this group talking about what I consider to be the important issue in our profession right now. I hear those figures from Pearl, and they're very disappointing, but I hope they are not discouraging to the point of keeping us from moving forward and taking the bull by the horns and dealing with these issues. I've been practicing now for 40 years. We have been talking about these issues during that entire period, but we have not had the success in dealing with the issue that we need to have had after 4 decades. And I'm hopeful that we are at a moment in our history, for a whole range of reasons, that we could actually take this problem and deal with it, so that somebody like Pearl does not look at a figure like she just showed on the screen and feel discouraged by it. To me, it's a call to action, and that's what I come away with. I just want to very quickly make one more quick point. This has an impact. It's not just the numbers, and it's not just about equity and diversity. It's also about what it means to be a lawyer. It is not a satisfying experience to be a member of a community that does not have diverse voices. I think it makes it a less satisfying profession. And so I think we all have to work towards this goal together of increasing diversity, increasing inclusion for all of our sakes.
Such an interesting point that you make around the value of the diverse workplace. Certainly the business case for diversity is quite clear, but you're right, there is something to be said about overall satisfaction in our work that can also be attained as we work in more diverse workplaces. Sandra, would love to hear from you and your perspective around your reactions to the data that Pearl shared with us.
Yeah, it shows a number of things. First, that we do need to have a more inclusive work environment, if only so that those of our colleagues who would count themselves as either having disabilities or who are LGBTQ+ feel more comfortable identifying as such in public, so that that data could become more robust. It also shows, I think, the importance of collecting the data in such a way that we can disaggregate it, because the biggest mistake that employers can make, I think, is sometimes treating all diverse lawyers as if we're just a homogenous group. Our issues are different, the challenges we face are different, the biases and the prejudices directed against us differ. And therefore, it's important to be able to disaggregate the data so that we can see the differences.
Absolutely. I believe that there are certainly still challenges that exist for the advancement of women, and we see that certainly here in the legal profession, and to be honest, in many corporate industries. I agree and take your point about the need for segmentation and the need to enhance our ability to collect data related to our LGBTQ+ community, as well as those with disabilities. So really good insights, and I take away the disappointed but not discouraged. I do believe that we have a new and more urgent mandate than we've had before, certainly in the wake of the calls for social justice and more racial equality and equity in our society and in our profession. And so Pearl, I wonder if you could talk with us about what this means to millennials when you uncovered this data and as you reflect on the experiences that you're having perhaps with your cohort of fellow law school students. What is the mandate that we need to understand as we think about creating more diverse and inclusive workplaces?
Yes, and Rhonda, I am so glad that we recognize this now as a mandate, no longer an option, no longer a recommendation, but a mandate, because that's exactly what it is. As someone who's starting off in law, still in law school, I look at these numbers and I first of all, I have to thank those who came before me, those who came before my generation, because it was much worse for them. But they powered through it. And because of them, these figures are even at 0.7 for me, as far as, a Black woman who was a partner. Because at one point, those figures were zero. And so there has been a lot of progress made. But in light of everything that is going on, not just across the world, but specifically in our nation, there's been this awakening. There has been this, our parents and our parents' parents, when it came to the workforce as a whole, just tolerated, being employed and getting by just being employed. But there is something to be said of even our parents telling us, you don't have to take that. You don't have to settle for somewhere where you're just tolerated and not appreciated. And that, I believe, is what is fueling this mandate. Because as Jerry spoke of earlier, it has an impact. It's not just about diversity. It's not just about inclusion. There is a real impact. It transcends just our profession, and it goes to how we live. It goes to our livelihood. When we're seeing headlines, of injustice across our nation, it's not just, it's not just isolated to outside workplaces. It also infiltrates, our work, how we work. It infiltrates, our values, and just how skewed of an experience we have when we don't have an inclusive experience, when we don't have a diverse experience. And I think that mandate now, my colleagues and I, when we look at these numbers, we think, oh, absolutely not. This has to get better. And it's no longer, we'll sit by and hope it gets better. No, we're actively shunning, and I want to use that word, we're shunning companies who offer us major money, but we know that when we go there, we won't be appreciated there. We'll be a token there. There's this idea of tokenism that just doesn't fit well with my generation. I put out a poll, and this was just for fun. I put out a poll among those in my cohort, and it was pretty much wanting to assess if you were making top dollar at a firm, but you knew that you were just being hired as sort of this token Black face in their, in the company, just to check off the box, check off, we have a person who is a person of color, or who is a woman, or who identifies as LGBT. We have this person, so we've checked that off. Would you take that? And the answer was overwhelmingly no. I don't care how much you pay me. I'm not going to be your token. And so this speaks to that mandate. This speaks to, of course, and like Sandra said earlier, we're not homogenous. People of color, women, people of the LGBT community, we're not a monolith. And so we all come to this with different insights. But overwhelmingly, the response is, this is a mandate because we're not going to tolerate, no matter how much you pay us, not having an inclusive force. There's one thing to be diverse, but if it's not inclusive, we'll only be there for so long. If we even get there at all, that is.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I spend quite a bit of time talking with young talent or people who are new to their career. And we talk a lot about this concept of tokenism and not wanting to be token and truly acknowledging that you are talent. And when you are talent, you want to be accepted and included in the organization and regarded as talent, developed as talent. And I can see why many of your colleagues say, no, I want to come into a firm or into an organization and know that that is a place where I can have a tremendous sense of belonging and feel a sense of inclusion. And if that is indeed the mandate, and if we want a diverse workforce and we want that talent, then what are the practices that we need to build or continue in our workplaces? Specifically, as we think about this here in the United States and even globally, with this being our international summit. And so let's start, Sandra, with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the strategies that you're seeing as effective as building inclusion in the workplace.
You know, it's multifaceted. And so it can range from, you know, the really simple, more mundane practices like having a really good work allocation program in your organization to make sure that that everyone is getting their opportunity to have some of the best and most challenging work and to really learn and grow, to more complex policies, you know, like mandating the diversity on the legal team that's going to be appearing before a particular judge or things like that. What's sad is the fact that we've had to come to the realization that it's not going to just happen organically. We have to keep pushing and prodding and pulling along. And we've had to do that just to get to where we are now. I think that the mistake we make is to just assume that somehow it's going to get better. I agree with Pearl and her generation and the desire not to be tokenized. But I see in my own generation that there have been plenty of us who it was a question of that or nothing. You know, if you look at the demographics surrounding, let's say, African-American partners in large law firms, you know, there's something like, you know, 45,000 large law firm partners in the US, and like less than 1,000 of them are African-American. So you know that there are lots of them who are having to feel that sense of isolation and alienation. And it's hard. So anything we can do to make it easier for people to find the kind of support they need, whether it's through, you know, well-being programs in organizations, to outright strategies in terms of here's how we make sure that work gets assigned and everybody has a chance to grow and develop. You can jump in anywhere on that spectrum and improve things.
Sandra, thank you. So work allocation, wellness, certainly a good point there, especially as we think about how we've started to see the lines blur between work, our work and life, right? Our personal and professional lives, and that need to be able to find that balance and have wellness is so important. And I do believe that is a strategy to ensure a more inclusive workplace. Jerry, can we hear from you? Can you talk with us from a senior partner perspective and some things that you've seen be effective as you think about creating more inclusive workplaces?
Sure, and let me just start. Two general points. I mean, one is that all of these efforts have to be collaborative, and we've got to find the right balance between two ends of the spectrum. And one end of that spectrum is dictating what we're going to be doing about these issues. The other end of the spectrum is dumping this issue on our diverse lawyers and saying, you figure it out. And I've seen little bits of both of those, and I think they both have serious problems with them. If this is not collaborative, it's not going to work. And related to that, I've got people like me, we're lawyers, we're used to giving advice, we're used to having answers. That's what we're paid by our clients to do. We've got to sit back a little bit, and we've got to hear from others, learn from others, and realize we don't have all the answers. And the proof of the pudding that we don't have all the answers are the statistics that Pearl just shared with us and the points that Sandra just made. So with that recognition Some of the things that we have been trying to do, and I hope we're trying to do this on a collaborative basis, really divided up in 6 general areas: pipeline, recruiting, retention, partnership, leadership of the firm, and then our involvement with the community. And on all of these, we're trying to be creative, to collaborate with our diverse lawyers and with the entire firm, young lawyers to more senior lawyers like myself, to try to come up with new ways to approach the issue, given that our success rate so far as a country has not been very impressive. So for example, pipeline issues, we've created a fellowship program in order to help college grads who want to go to law school, who are from diverse backgrounds, figure out how to do so, how to take the LSAT, get training in LSAT, meet role models. We have a 1L diversity program and a 2L diversity program, all trying to increase the pipeline of diverse attorneys. We're trying to expand in terms of recruitment, where we look for lawyers, where we look for talent, and make sure that we're looking in places that long-standing firms have not looked for many years. We're adding additional law schools to where we go to recruit, and looking to others to tell us where we can continue to increase our talent pool. We're working really hard on retention of our diverse lawyers, because I got to tell you, it is not satisfying, and it is not the way to go to recruit diverse attorneys and then lose them, because you don't pay attention to the issue of how you make sure that they feel part of the law firm. So we have affinity groups, we have a dedicated committee to diversity and retention issues. That committee is involved in all aspects of an associate's life from the time that he or she joins the firm. We try to have a lot of conversation about these issues. Sometimes these issues are just sort of not spoken to. So for example, we have lunch talks where diverse attorneys talk about their experience. I've given talks from the LGBT perspective about what it's like. And I remember the very first time I gave a lunch talk about this, somebody raised their hand and said, well, it must be hard for you to think of things, because obviously for you, it hasn't really been something that's affected your career. And I just laughed and I said, it's something that affects my career every day, every hour. It's something that's always present. And so we try to be open and have conversation. And I think that's a really important and best practice, and probably the most important one I'll mention. We try to have a diversity committee and those involved who are focused on these issues review all of our associate review processes and our partnership review processes, our compensation processes, to make sure that there are not hidden biases. We've tried to change our interviewing techniques to behavioral based rather than types of interviews which can lend themselves more to implicit bias. We've also tried to recognize that we must have diversity in our leadership, not just in our partnership, in our managing partners and the heads of committees. And we've taken great strides there. Our managing partner, one of our 2 managing partners now, is an Asian American woman. And that has had a huge impact. It makes the firm a better law firm. And I can't emphasize that enough. And lastly, we've tried to engage with the community generally, especially in reaction to events in our country over the past couple of years. We've created a committee devoted to voting issues, to police reform, working with different legal groups outside, really with a very specific and intentional effort to increase our community efforts. We just changed our firm banking relationship to the nation's largest African-American run bank. Just try to engage with the community in a deeper, more meaningful way. Again, I don't have the answers, and I recognize that. I look to others to hear reaction, but these are things that we've been trying to do in recognition of how much progress we need to make.
I love a lot of the strategies that Jerry just suggested, because I think that they're really important, especially the one about using a new African-American owned bank. I think that's tremendous, and you deserve a lot of credit for that. I also think, though, that we have to bear in mind that one of the things that we can do is not emphasize so much that we're trying to fix diverse attorneys, but that what we're really trying to do is make it so that anyone with the aptitude, the ability, the desire, the ambition, the competency can enter the profession and rise as high within it as those abilities would take them. And part of that is, as Americans, I think we need to be open to the idea that, you know, there may be a lot of DEI strategies that we can adopt also from other countries. I think a lot of times when we get into this DEI space, we tend to think that as Americans, we are somehow so much more authoritative. And it's true, you know, we have a long history of these efforts in the US. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're the only source of those ideas. And so I think that some of the most promising strategies that I've seen lately, like work allocation, have actually come from overseas. You know, I think that a lot of the London law firms are far ahead of the US in work allocation. I think that a lot of the British companies and some of the companies in the EU are farther ahead when it comes to contextual recruiting and blind recruiting. And those are policies that, you know, we talk about a little bit in the US, but haven't necessarily been adopted. But we do have to think big picture, because a lot of the challenges we also face is that when we're thinking about diversity, we're thinking about it in a multifaceted way. So that, for instance, you know, a lot of pipeline programs, which I think are important and ought to be supported, tend to assume that, you know, if we are just patient, you know, it'll go away. If we focus on pipeline, we just get more bodies into the profession, more diverse people, that's going to resolve the problem. Whereas, you know, if you dig into it a little bit, you'll see that the Asian American experience sort of proves that actually there's racism at work, because that's a community that, you know, you have plenty of Asian American lawyers who are actually overrepresented for their population size entering law firm practice. You have them in disproportionate numbers being successful at attaining the kinds of pedigree and attendance at elite law schools that we value so much in this profession. And yet they have the worst rate of conversion from associate to partner. And so if, despite all the pedigree and all the other values that we arbitrarily place on what makes a good lawyer isn't working for them, you know, you're kind of left to assume that, well, it's racism. And that's a factor in this profession that we haven't really grappled with. You know, we'd like to think of this profession as if it were a meritocracy. We've been conditioned to think that because we value the rule of law, it's a meritocracy. And yet there's plenty of evidence to the contrary.
Sandra, thank you for that. I think it's a great point, and I appreciate you calling out some of the better practices, especially that we see from other countries. Jerry, I'd be interested in also hearing your perspective, especially a global perspective, as you think about creating inclusive and diverse workplaces.
Yeah, it is putting on my hat as ex-UIA president rather than Munger Toll's lawyer. What Sandra says is so interesting. First of all, I completely agree. The UK has is ahead of us in many ways. I recently heard a talk by Stephanie Boyce, who is the new head of the Law Society of England and Wales, an extraordinary woman who, as a Black woman in the United States, she spent time in the United States, and as she said, ran back to England because she found the experience in the UK as a lawyer much more satisfying and found much more equity there. And that really made a huge impact on me, hearing that from her. I think she's going to be a real leader in the international profession, and I look forward to seeing her work. On the other hand, when I look around the world, you know, the issues are so different in different countries. I've worked on and talked about diversity issues in Asia, for example, countries that are much more homogeneous generally. And so certainly the diversity issues there are different. And yet they have diversity issues, issues with respect to women, first of all, but other types of categorizations that you might find surprising. Regional, very strong regional differences. In Korea, everything depends on what school you went to get your law degree, and what school you grew up in. And so there are these different categorizations, and in my view, having spoken with a lot of these folks about these issues, I think the US is more attuned to the need for change on some of these points than I have seen in other countries. We have a long way to get there, but this is one of the reasons why I feel a little bit more disappointed and less discouraged, is because I do think these issues are spoken about and considered to be a problem and an issue that needs to be addressed by the profession more than in many places around the world. And of course, when you go to, if you have responsibility for diversity in other countries, you've got to take into account their background, their culture, their demographics. All of these are very different and give rise to different issues. But at the same time, you got to stick to your core, your fundamental values, which is exactly what Sandra just said, that somebody who wants to be prominent and successful in the profession, regardless of their background, regardless of whatever category you want to apply, should feel that they can do so.
Absolutely, Jerry. I couldn't agree more. And Pearl, you've heard some of the strategies that are being employed. Is it enough? What else should we be thinking about?
Absolutely. So first off, I do applaud the strategies, and it's, I'm taking away from this panel what Jerry said. It's disappointing, but we're not discouraged, and it is encouraging to know that those ahead of us are employing strategies to make things better, to make things more diverse and more inclusive. I think work allocation is going to be a game changer. Because I think that's what contributes to, even when you have diversity, even when you've managed to somehow draw in diverse talent, getting them to stay it's a different thing. And I think there has to be some kind of strategy that not just draws diverse talent in, but also keeps us there. And I believe the root of this issue has to do with code switching. Not just on a domestic level, but also on a global level. I'm a Black woman, I'm a young Black woman, but I'm also a Ghanaian, I'm from Ghana. And I find myself consistently code switching. What do I mean by code switching? All of us, to a level, have to change how we present when we're at work, of course, than when we're at home with friends. It's just professional to do so. But when it's to the level where you are constantly in discomfort, because you can't figure out, in my culture, looking at an adult or looking at a superior or someone who is placed above you, an authority over you, looking at them in the eye can be insulting. Versus when I don't look up in an American culture, that's insulting, that's disrespectful, or that shows a lack of confidence. And it takes a toll on you when you are constantly, even, of course, I'm a Black woman, and how I talk to my friends is different from how I talk at work, of course. But I don't find that my white colleagues have the same issue. How they speak with friends is generally how they speak at work. It takes a toll on you going to work day in, day out. When you think about, especially the legal profession, the amount of time you spend at working with colleagues, to constantly be in a state where you are some other than yourself, it is wearying. At some point you figure, okay, I need a break. I've got to go somewhere where I can breathe and be myself. And just a story on this, last year before my 1L summer, on the job hunt, on the hunt to land a summer internship, I was shocked that a big thing that kept coming up was, Pearl, how are you going to wear your hair to this interview? Now, normally I wear my hair in an afro. It's a small afro. And I was told the law is very conservative. If you want to, be impressive, not just by your grades or not just by what you've done in school, but also present well, you're going to have to change your hair. I thought about that for a while. I'm thinking, okay, in the Black community, your hair is a pretty big deal as a Black woman. And so for me, that said, is my hair really gonna to negate my accomplishments and what I bring to the table, my work ethic, my grades? Is my hair really going to negate all of that? And I know it's a sum, it may seem silly, but to have to wear my hair in a conservative manner for the rest of my life as a lawyer is discouraging. It may seem silly to others, but for me, that played a role. That played a role. And so when I found that I went to an interview and that was something that was actually welcomed, that played a role as to what my decision was, as to where I would go. To some, that's so trivial. To me, that's one less thing that I have to code switch on. I can wear my hair in a fro, and that again does not negate my ability. I'm so glad that both Sandra and Jerry spoke to one's ability. Your ability is not affected by how you wear your hair. It's not affected by your skin tone. It's not affected by, in many ways, what school you went to. I know that we tend to think that the school you went to correlates to your ability, but there are many gifted, hardworking, extraordinary, diverse talent who are not at Harvard, who are not at Yale, who are not at a a T14 school. And we have to come away from this idea of conservatism when it comes to the law. Sandra spoke about this when she was just speaking. You know, we have to change how we view what makes a good lawyer, what makes a competent attorney. If your work product, is there, if your ability to learn is there, why would your school or the school you went to, your pedigree, be a disqualification for you? And as long as recruiting partners are fixated on this idea of pedigree, where did you go to school? Did you come from a family of attorneys? How well connected are you when it comes to networking in the legal industry? How well connected are you? If that's what we're going off of, we're going to keep having a drastically lacking body or diverse, but when it comes to diversity, you're not going to get top talent. And if you do, you're not going to keep them because code switching is wearying. Code switching is extremely wearying. And so if I know that I have been drawn into a firm based on what I bring to the table, based on being, I think of myself as, a brilliant, hardworking person who will outwork anyone if I have to. If I'm brought to the table based on that, and I know that I don't have to constantly leave myself at home when I come to work, I'm going to stay. Of course, I'm going to stay. Not only will I stay, I will make sure that I bring more of my colleagues in. I find that right now, most of my text messages are, do you feel like you'll be accepted at this law firm? Do you feel like you'll be accepted, or do you feel like I will be accepted at this law firm? That's a huge point of conversation for my colleagues and I. Yes, this seems like a great opportunity, but I don't know if I'll be able to rise up at this firm or at this company. And we're talking about that quite aggressively, among my colleagues and I. Yes, we can get in, but are we going to have to, like I said, be someone else when we get to work all the time? Or will we be embraced for our whole self when we get there? And so there has to be, we were speaking of this earlier, Rhonda, this tearing down of this idea of what makes a great lawyer. I am a first generation college student, let alone law school student, let alone future attorney in my family. And I am not privy to conversations about how to get a deal at the dinner table. I'm not privy to, certain legal lingo. I've learned that all in law school, but I am able to learn. That's my aptitude. I am able to learn. I'm able to acquire knowledge and to apply it, and I think successfully. And I think when recruiting managers and hiring attorneys shift from what's your pedigree to what's your raw ability and how can I invest in you, that's going to be such a catalyst in not only bringing in diverse attorney, but also keeping diverse attorney in the door.
Wow, so powerful, Pearl. Sandra, I'd like to ask you a bit more, because I know that you talk quite a bit about how we need to challenge ourselves and what has historically been a really elitist profession. And so what do you believe is the call to action? And what are the concrete things that as leaders in our industry we should be thinking about doing as we consider the discussion today?
Well, I think that Pearl's comments about code switching are so true. And my generation, at least, I think we have absorbed it to the point where we see it as it was just one more thing that we had to do to survive. But I think that it goes to maybe refocusing the narrative. The narrative should be less emphasis on how Pearl would care to wear her hair and more on what truly makes a good leader in this profession. And the lesson that we can take away, I think, about inclusive workplaces, especially from global organizations, is that good leadership relies heavily on leaders having a lot of cultural competencies. And I think too often, at least in the American legal profession, that's really not emphasized at all. So that's why, even though Jerry and I, when we came out of law school, we may have had to have conformed and done a lot of code switching, and it was the norm. The fact that Pearl's generation is still having to do that, I think, highlights the need for workplaces where the leaders have more cultural competencies so that there would be less of a necessity for that. That there's less of an emphasis on what should Pearl and her generation do to make older lawyers feel comfortable so they don't have to get outside their comfort zone, and more about what can they be doing to truly be global leaders. Because if you look at the most successful corporations in the world, if we decide to use corporations as a standard of success and excellence, they have to have those competencies. You can't be so narrowly focused that you only see it one way.
Absolutely. And your point around really doing the work and thinking about how do we reframe the narrative is such a good one. And I think Jerry earlier said, it's not just the work of the diverse talent, right? But also the existing leadership structure. And so Jerry, I wonder if you could talk a bit more on your concept of the call to action, and specifically what your hope is for existing leadership structures of our profession as we think about enhancing diversity and inclusion in our profession.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I just want to respond to one point that Pearl made, because I think it's so true, and just give an example of why I feel like there are glimmers of progress. Our 1L and 2L diversity program, for example, was designed to get at part of what Pearl was speaking about. Does the person, regardless of whether they had a family of lawyers or how they wear their hair or any of the other issues that Pearl raised, does the person show initiative? Does the person, has this candidate done something, regardless of schools or pedigree, that really shows somebody who's going for it and has the type of raw ability that Pearl said? Well, that kind of thinking, which is how we created the 1L and 2L program, I am happy to say, has started to impact our general recruitment, because it's made us realize that's not just a 1L or 2L diversity issue. That's how we get the best candidates for the law firm, is by looking at those kinds of qualities. And I'm seeing that more and more enter into our general discussions, and I think all for the better, and I think it's a sign of progress. That said, to the point about leadership, it's a very difficult issue, because we are, to be honest, I think many firms are still clinging to the way in which law firms have run for many, many years, which is that as you get more and more senior, you become the leader of the firm. And you can make an argument for that. You've been at the firm longer, you have more experience with the law firm. But if you just do that, if your leadership is just based on somebody who came in the 1970s or 80s and has worked their way, or 80s or 90s, and slowly worked their way up, if you don't bring diversity to your leadership, there is a stagnancy that just takes over, because you are just reproducing year after year what you have done for the past decade. So from my perspective, the real challenge is sharing in the top leadership of the firm so that the voices like Pearl's can be heard at the highest levels, not just what young associates are texting each other, and rather what you're texting me, and while how you and I are addressing an issue. That I think is the challenge, and it means pulling out of our comfort zones. It means treating law firms differently, treating law firm leadership differently than we have been, that most firms do, frankly. But I again, not to be Pollyanna, I do see glimmers of that happening, especially in recent years. I do think that this issue is making its way. I think people are opening their eyes to the need for it because our progress has been, frankly, inadequate over the past several decades where we've been using all these other techniques.
Without a doubt. With that, I thought it might be helpful to at least share a bit before we open up our discussion to the audience for questions, a little bit about what we're doing at LexisNexis related to our IND strategy, and offer up a bit of what we're seeing as a result of listening to some of our clients, but also responding to our desire to bring in the best and brightest. So there are 3 specific areas that our CEO, Mike Walsh, identified as our IND strategic focus area. And I think there's some real key takeaways here. So the first is, most importantly, everything we've been talking about today, enhancing our culture of inclusion and diversity. So what can we do to ensure that everyone who's already part of our organization feels a tremendous sense of belonging? And then what do we do to increase representation of diverse individuals in our organization? We also, of course, in alignment with our commitment to the rule of law, have a commitment to eliminating systemic racism in our legal systems. And a big part of how we're doing that is through our LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation Fellowship Program, of which Pearl is a part. We have 11 other fellows from the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Law School Consortium who are also journeying with us over 9 months to explore issues related to systemic racism. And we're including employees from all over the world to think about how we can eliminate systemic racism in our legal systems all over the world, and have seen some tremendous ideas put forth and are using processes related to innovation to do just that. And then being an advocate for Black lives, and we're unapologetic about that. And we state it loudly, we state it clearly. We know that this is a community that absolutely requires some special care and attention, and we are really committed to ensuring that we are an advocate for Black lives. Now, we know that this system that we find ourselves in didn't build overnight, and you don't dismantle it overnight. And so we know that we're on a journey, and we are thinking about this in a few years sprints over several years. And our focus last year and this year has been all about communicating our strategic direction related to inclusion and diversity, and we're moving into the direction of embedding our culture and ensuring that our colleagues and our leaders see ours as a culture of inclusion, and it becomes a part of everything we do. When we talk about performance, when we talk about the way we form teams, when we talk about selecting new talent, inclusion and diversity is a perspective, a paradigm that we see those activities through. And we know that because the business case is really clear, will lead us to a point of being higher performing as a business. Now, we use a framework, and I've heard, this is really encouraging because I've heard glimpses of this throughout all of the discussion today, especially as we heard some of what Sandra calls better practices, and Jerry, all of the great things that you shared with us from your global firm. And then Pearl talked about, it's not just enough to recruit diverse talent, but how do you keep them there? We launched a study several years ago with the Boston Consulting Group and identified this as a framework. And we were studying gender balance then, but certainly believe and see how this can also apply to race and ethnicity and other aspects of diversity. And so we have identified this I&D framework in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group. And this framework is how we talk as a leadership team about all of the initiatives that we're driving around I&D, is how we talk from colleague to colleague, because sometimes I&D can feel like the ocean, right? It feels so overwhelming, right? We saw stats 30, 40 years old at the beginning of this, and sometimes it can feel very overwhelming. And as I'm coaching and talking with leaders, I often talk about, here are the 4 areas really that we're talking about making steps in. And so the first is around leadership, and that is ensuring that people who are in leadership positions at the in your organization are visible and loud and accountable about the importance of inclusion and diversity, and that there's clear communication and there's metrics. Advancement, that's all about supporting career advancement through strong sponsorship. Mentorship is great, sponsorship is better. Sponsorship is this idea of people talking about you even when you're not in the room, to move you up a level, get you pulled into that project. Is much more than the occasional coffee, but is truly someone who makes it their mission to grow your career, to get you promoted, to land you that big opportunity. Recruiting, of course, we know is a lever as we think about increasing representation in our organization, and then certainly retention. And I spend a lot of my time in this particular area because you cannot over-recruit an attrition issue when it comes to inclusion and diversity. And so for all of the work that we do to attract diverse talent, we certainly want to retain them. And Jerry, your point was such a good one earlier, that a more diverse place makes for a happier, more engaging, diverse workplace. And so this also becomes a matter of retention. So really quickly, what does that look like? So we have developed a global I&D council where we have members of our global senior leadership team from every business unit and function sit on a council and meet with us regularly. Or meet as a council regularly to talk about I&D and how we start to embed that in the organization. We're also measuring, for example, I&D sentiment among our employees and asking them explicitly, in your opinion, is our organization committed to inclusion and diversity? And we're looking to see if there are differences between how our ethnic minority employees answer that question, how our women answer that question compared to our white employees or our male employees. In recruiting, we are working really hard to have mission and purpose-driven messaging. We're lucky at LexisNexis because our mission is about advancing the rule of law, and there are a lot of people passionate about that around the world. And so we lead with that, and are also doing a lot of work to help talent understand why ours is a great place to work and a great place to grow your career. And we have to deliver on that through advancement. So we're launching programs like formal mentorship programs, sponsorship programs, similar to what Sandra and Jerry have mentioned. And we know that these are things that have been done, and we're trying to do them well and make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable to really get those results. And then finally, with retention, some of the neat things that we're doing here is we're providing at least 2 work days to every employee across the organization around the world to commit to what we call employee resource groups or affinity groups. These are groups that contribute to professional development, community outreach, and social networking opportunities around groups related to race, or our Pride group for the LGBTQ community, disabled individuals, and so forth. We're also building content to increase our acumen as it relates to inclusion and diversity, and increasing that cultural awareness, and then ensuring that we're enabling our managers with data to measure and monitor employee engagement, because we know if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. And so that brings me to this last piece. One of the things that we developed is this concept of an I&D scorecard, where every business leader in our organization regularly gets this scorecard, and they're able to measure how they're doing on a couple of key initiatives, whether it be the percentage of managers who have completed unconscious bias, the number of diverse individuals, women, ethnic minorities that you've hired into senior roles. We also are using psychological safety, which is some really good work pioneered by Amy Edmondson of the Harvard Business School, that shows us that who is on the team matters less than how those team members interact. And so inclusion becomes a really significant measure of inclusion, or the psychological safety becomes a really great measure of inclusion in the workplace. And so we're looking at a psychological safety index regularly for each of our teams to understand if we see practices of appreciating diversity, taking risk, being okay with failing and experimenting, and some of those things that we know lead to innovation and ultimately higher performing teams. So those are some of the things that we're doing at LexisNexis. This framework has kind of been our guide over the last year, as we, like many other organizations, are really looking to drive that inclusive and diverse workplace. So with that, I'd like to pause here and ask the group to share questions, and we'll open it up to questions. I see one here and that I'll ask. So a lot of the conversation seems to be implicitly about big law and big corporations. More than 50% of lawyers are in small firms, which once again seem to be forgotten. How are you reaching out to firms with 2 to 25 lawyers to help them become more inclusive? Sandra, is that one you might be able to take? I know that
Sure. Yes, the questioner is absolutely right. There does always seem to be an implicit assumption that we're talking about the largest law firms and large corporations. And part of that is because the data is so much better about them. So it's so much easier to track what's happening. But that's not to say that smaller organizations don't also need to be thinking about how to create an inclusive work environment. Sometimes for smaller organizations, it's actually harder because they've gotten used to operating in a certain way. Maybe they have their own policies and practices where they don't have necessarily the resources and the scale to be trying things. So for instance, in a very large firm, you could have one practice group, which could be the size of a small firm, tackle work allocation to see if that works, where it can be a little bit riskier sometimes in a smaller firm. But I have seen a lot of small firms who actually I think have greater potential in terms of their ability to create a very inclusive environment. But it does take a lot of work, and it probably is no easier and no harder than it is for a large firm, but the potential is certainly there. And I actually personally find them a lot more fun to work with sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Pearl, I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of the comments in the chat box, but a lot of appreciation for the work that you did to bring the data to us to help us understand the current state of diversity in our profession, and just some overall kudos around what you've brought to this panel, and I certainly couldn't agree more. Are there other questions? We'd love to take some more questions from the group. Feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. We'll pick them up from both places.
And Rhonda, while we're waiting on more questions to come in, I just want to say thanks to those who are here, and also thank you to, again, I'm very grateful for those who have come before me. When I say come before me, I don't mean, years and years back, even as recent as people I just met, who are doing practical things to make sure that there is not only diversity, but also inclusion. And I do want to put out there that, diverse talent can tell companies who are serious about diversity and inclusion versus those who say that they are and aren't willing to walk the walk. a reoccurring statement is, well, we're doing so much to find diverse talent, we just can't seem to find diverse talent. And when we hear that from, leadership at organizations, not only large organizations, but even small ones, we understand that it takes a lot to run a business, run any kind of business, and to get to your level of leadership at your business. So if you apply the kind of energy that you apply to get where you are, you apply that same energy into getting and including diverse talent, I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to accomplish that goal. And it's a very practical example. And kudos to you for this, Rhonda. So as a fellow at LexisNexis, I'm working on a project to tackle racial and diversity, if I can use that word, across the law. And one of the methods that we're applying is mentoring. Reverse mentoring is one of those. It would take a lot of humility, but what if, as a leader at a firm or a leader at a legal organization, you're humble enough to say, hey, diverse talent, I want you to be my mentor. How can I make this space more inclusive for you? And be willing to listen to very candid, very candid feedback, and not just listen to it, but also be willing to apply that feedback. That's you're hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And the fact that you're willing to apply those tactics sends a loud message to those who are, scoping your law firm or legal organization to see if they want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Reverse mentoring is such an effective tool, especially for senior leaders who don't really have access to some of this junior talent, especially if they're diverse. You may not have a lot of diverse people, if you're honest, in your circle, right? People that you're communing with every day, that you're in meetings with, that you're socializing with. And so reverse mentoring is one way to get access to talent that may be younger in their career, who may come from a diverse background, so that you can raise your cultural awareness. But you've got to do that in you've got to be in a posture of receiving, right? And see yourself there to learn from that individual. And by the way, pay it forward, right? And think about how you can help sponsor them and be a part of their own career development. And I've seen magic happen when senior leaders are willing to be vulnerable and take on relationships like reverse mentoring. Tanya asks, what is being done to help sole practitioners maintain their profession and fight against the push out of minority attorneys in rural areas as it relates to state bar membership? More sole or small practice minority attorneys are targeted and pursued for disbarment. What is being done to help sole practitioners maintain their profession and fight against the push out of minority attorneys in rural areas as it relates to state bar membership? More sole or small practice minority attorneys are targeted and pursued for disbarment. Is there anyone on the panel who can speak to that specifically?
Some of it is, some of the efforts really focus on one, trying to assess who is actually on a particular state's regulatory body that would evaluate some of these things, and to make sure that they have, again, the cultural competencies that leaders in the profession need these days. Some of it has been coming through state, metropolitan, and local bar associations that have been trying to address some of these areas, because the person is absolutely right. It is a concern about the way solo and small practice lawyers are oftentimes targeted for disbarment.
Great, thank you.
I guess I could address that, because if I would be allowed to. That is an issue that we look at the National Bar Association. Without a question, we have seen a trend that's been going on for a long time in a lot of places, especially in places where the numbers of minority lawyers is very, very low. Where solo practitioners and very, very dynamic lawyers are targeted because they pose a threat, a business threat. And one of the things that can be done is you've got to reach out to your affinity bars, because affinity bars are those who fight for you. What do I mean by affinity bars? The National Bar is an affinity bar, the Women's Bar Association, just depending upon your demographic, reaching out to them because they do have capabilities to help and stand in solidarity with you. That's what happens. The same thing happens in the medical profession. I represent a few African-American doctors who were targeted in certain areas because of their level of success. And so the best tool is to reach out to those who may have a section or division that can help you with that, because many people have experienced that before. And just to remember, you're not alone. You don't have to travel that road alone.
Thank you, President Hoffler. Great insights there. All right, so my background is in talent development, and we are nearing the end of our session. And often when I am working with leaders, and I've had the opportunity to kind of spend a great amount of time with them, with shared insights, I ask them for their wisdom, which is an acronym for what I shall do on Monday. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists to share with me your wisdom, because this has been a learning experience for us. As we've shared, we've learned from each other. And we talk so much about the call to action. So I'd like to hear your wisdom and your closing thought as you think about what you should do on Monday. Jerry, can we start with you?
I gotta say, it's very easy for me, because listening to Pearl makes me realize that I have so much to learn and to hear about. That my wisdom is I and others like me need to be reaching out to our younger lawyers, to our diverse lawyers, and hearing about their experience and their recommendations, that this is an issue on which I do not have the answers, and I need to hear from others rather than just speaking out my own view. So I look forward to doing that in exactly the way that Pearl proposed.
Outstanding. Thank you, Jerry. Sandra, we'd love to hear your wisdom.
I'm going to go try to find some powerful white man in the profession and save him from himself. I think a lot of times they don't know what they don't know. And it would be nice if we had more women and diverse attorneys in those positions, but we don't. And so I think right now, some of the best efforts are how we can help them become among the converted. Because when they do become converted, they can be very powerful allies. Because I think that the mistake that gets made too often is that sometimes the burden of fixing everything is always put on the shoulders of the diverse attorneys. And I think we've done a great job so far. We've made progress, but there's so much more to do. And it's not just our responsibility.
It's great wisdom. Thank you so much, Sandra. Pearl, what is your wisdom that you'd like to leave us with?
And first of all, thanks to all of you for your wisdom. I think I've drawn a lot from listening to all of you. And there are two things I shall do on Monday. The first thing is to remember to always hold the door open. And what I mean by that is, once I get in the door in different legal spaces, making sure that I don't lose the energy. Just looking at the fact that, the IALP has put together all this data. It took a lot of work to put this together. Just looking at the fact that Jerry is doing so much at his firm, the fact that, he switched over from a bank to an African-American owned bank speaks volumes. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Literally.
Right. Just holding the door open and just not letting up. When I get in the door, which is the first thing to do, is making sure to look back at other diverse talent to make sure that they feel comfortable, that they know that it's not only possible, but like with what Jerry said, I'll always take that with me. It may be disappointing, but it's not discouraging. The number as far as Black women partners go may be 0.7, but that is up from what it used to be. And so I applaud those words, and I will carry that with me. And in summation, what I shall do on Monday, go in the door and make sure I hold it open for other diverse talent who may be coming with or after me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pearl. You've shared so much wisdom today. And the wisdom that I'll leave you with before turning it back over to Nigel to close us out will be to remind us and remind everyone that I have the chance to interact with that there is a call to action and there is a mandate. And especially as we think about emerging from this pandemic and going back to what some people call normal, I wonder if we might consider that so many people who didn't have voices before have miraculously found their voice at this time in history. And what I shall do on Monday is look for ways to amplify those voices. And this will be hard for many people in power, but really consider how you can amplify those voices and not look for ways to silence the voices that have finally been found. And I think the way we do that, my good friend Sandra said, we do that by being allies. And so what I would say is that we all have the opportunity to be allies. And for my new colleagues like Pearl who are entering the profession, I say, do not lose your voice. Surround yourself with people who will amplify it, and do not see yourself as a token. See yourself as talent and be empowered, because you have exactly what it takes to lead our profession into the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nigel and thank all of my panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you, Rhonda. There's really nothing for me to do other than to sincerely thank Jerry, Sandra, Pearl, and you, Rhonda, and especially CK Hoffler for giving us this opportunity to thank all of you for your time and your commitment and dedication to this. It's been a delight. I have one housekeeping to mention, and that's the CLE code. I think that that will go up on screen now. So to make sure you can get your CLE hours, please use this code, it's yellow. And again, my thanks to everybody. Stay well, and I hope that we can do this again sometime in the future in person.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So much. Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.